Today, I'm joined by my partner, Tim Baker, who, in addition to being a certified financial planner, is also a registered life planner, the center of today's topic. And as you know, we spend a lot of time on this show talking about the nuts and bolts of retirement planning, things like retirement income, building a retirement paycheck, Social Security timing, withdrawal strategies, tax efficient investing, and so on. All really important things. But here's the truth. A retirement income plan is not enough on its own. When you step away from decades of work, often after raising kids, building a career, and living within a structured routine, you're entering a phase of life where the biggest challenge is not just financial, it's also personal. Who are you now? What does your ideal day look like? And how do you make the most of this season of life with meaning and purpose? And that's where life planning comes in. And that's what we're talking about on today's episode. So, Tim, recently I had a conversation with Dave Zagaric on the podcast. It was episode 394. We'll link to that in the show notes. And it was all about his transition into retirement after a multi-decade career in academia. And during that episode, he shared the joys of that transition, but also some of the real challenges from moving into the new stage of life, navigating some of the questions like, what will my days look like? And how do I fill the time meaningful? And that's really the crux of what we wanted to talk about and have a conversation about today, because having money set aside is really only one piece of the puzzle. But without clarity on what you want life to look like, retirement has the potential to feel disoriented instead of freeing, right?
I was thinking about this the other day, Tim. And we're just personally, we're just at the phase of life right now where it's just like we go, right? We're so overbooked. And this is something I talked with my wife about all the time. We're so overbooked with kids' activities and just everything that you don't really have a chance to reflect. Right. And I was thinking about this with kind of when you're kind of, I don't want to say on a conveyor belt, but once you get into school, when you're Liam's age, is kindergarten now, right? You're scheduled, and then you have activities, and then you do that kind of all through high school. Then you go to college, and then you get a job, and you kind of have a 9 to 5, and you have a social life. Then you might get married and have kids, and you're kind of going through these phases, and it's so structured and scheduled that when you get to the other end of it with retirement and that goes away, you're like, what the heck? There's this void.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm just thinking about it and trying to look at this from the 30,000 foot view of where we're at, right? Because a couple of years ago we weren't here. We were kind of more in the, I was kind of thinking about this as we had not external strife, but just external busyness with activities in school and conferences and things like that. A couple of years ago, when the kids were really little, it was more of the internal strife or internal busyness. We're just trying to keep the little humans alive and make sure that they're eating and then they're sleeping. And, we have that at the end of the day now. We're just trying to get the kids to bed and things like that. But it's just so time consuming, right? That you don't have this period to reflect. And I think when you get to retirement, you start to think about that a little bit more so, but you strip away some of those roles that you have, right? So as a dad, I'm a caregiver, I'm changing diapers, I'm checking homework, I'm doing I'm not going to be doing that in retirement. So I'm always going to be a dad, but I'm not going to be a dad in that sense. So what does that look like for me, right? A lot of our clients, pharmacists, right? So that's a huge part of that's a huge part of their role, the hats that they wear. But if it bleeds into their identity, then that's kind of where we have a problem, right? So I think it's really important to think about this. And as I said before, is retirement is not the destination. It's just the next chapter, so to speak. But if you don't have the structure of the chapters like you've had before of go to, get good grades, go to school, get a nice job, practice as a pharmacist, whatever, what are we doing, right? And I think that's kind of what we're talking about here is, really understanding what is my purpose? What's a meaningful way for me to spend my time and resources? And I think that requires a bit of introspection.
Yeah. And a thought that's coming up as you're talking, Tim, couldn't agree more, right? This phase of life. I mean, I think the pace in which it's being lived, and you and I were talking just a month or two ago about hey, if you look at any normal day of the week and you fast forward then 20 years, just given the volume of kids' activities and other things, like the schedule will look very different, like no
Yeah.
question about it. And not to say that that phase of life won't have different challenges or time demands, things we're not thinking of necessarily in the moment. Um, but the thought that was coming to mind as you were talking is the preparation for retirement for you and I. Let's call ourselves kind of that mid career in our 40s. Like this is not a destination that we wait to plan for. Even as we talk about a methodology or a framework that will help us do that, this is not like a, hey, let me plan for this emotional transition, if you will, into retirement as I'm making the transition. I think a lot of this we need to be laying the foundation for now. When you think about things like community and hobbies and activities, right? What are those things that are going to play a significant role and take up a significant amount of our time in retirement that maybe not be present today or are difficult just given the time demands that are there.
Yeah, I think this is going to even become even more necessary because I just, my sense is, and this is again, not necessarily meant to be like a commentary of the state of the world, but I just think like our communities aren't as deep. Like I think about the community I grew up in, and where we grew up, and it's like, we have great neighbors and things, but it's not the same, right? So I think there is a lot more isolation. And I think there has to be more intent with, building communities and social stuff and that type of thing. But it's just really important because again, I think if you wait, it's just like the actual, act of planning for retirement. We're saving over hopefully decades, and investing over decades, for, that next chapter. I think you have to think about retirement and the social and the meaning behind and how you're gonna spend the time in a similar way. I'm not saying we have to do it for 20 years, but Shay and I talk about it now. Like what does that look like? And again, it's very abstract right now because a lot of things could change. But I think it's important to put that work in as well.
Yeah, and most of retirement planning, so I'm so excited about this conversation because most of retirement planning, as we have talked about on the show, right, it's focused about, hey, how much is enough? What is that number that we need? Or perhaps the next step of that would be what we call building a retirement paycheck. So, hey, we've arrived and we've reached that savings goal. Now, how are we going to distribute and build ourselves a paycheck in retirement and do it in the most tax efficient way possible? Here, we're kind of putting those things and saying, hey, they're important. But let's for a moment put those on the shelf and look at more of the qualitative aspects of transition into retirement.
And when I kind of, pitch prospective clients, like one of the questions I get all the time is like, what's the ROI of working with a financial planner? If you've never worked with one, or if you have worked with one, kind of what's the ROI of working with you? And, I kind of go through, Vanguard did a study back in the day called Advisor Alpha that basically says like, a good financial planner is going to add about 3% per year to the growth of your assets. It's basically what the study showed. But I think that's an incomplete view of ROI. I think if you look at it more broadly, I think net worth is a better number to track. And there was a study done, back in 2020 that said the average American's net worth grows by about 2% every year. So I look at that as a control group. Our clients do, no guarantees here, but our clients do way better than that, right? Because we're very intentional. We're good technicians. We know what we're doing. And we're talking about it. So I look at that, but I also think that that's incomplete.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the quantitative side. But I think the qualitative side are, in the accumulation phase of your life, it's grow your net worth, as much as you can, but also with an eye towards like, what are the things that are most important to you, whether it's a trip, buying an RV, taking sabbaticals, changing careers, whatever those qualitative things are really, really important. And I think when you get into retirement, those things remain. And instead of maybe like growing your net worth, we're just kind of trying to figure out on the quantitative side, spending it down in a way that we're not leaving money on the table, so to speak, but we're also not going to run out of money, when we don't know when we're going to pass away. So it's really it's less about growing your net worth on a quantitative perspective and really optimizing what your retirement paycheck, but the qualitative of what makes a wealthy life for you remains, no
Yeah.
matter if you're in the accumulation or the withdrawal phase. So, yeah, like it's important.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think the quantitative part, just speaking from where we're at, like in the moment, the quantitative part feels real. And if I go back to where I started coming out of pharmacy school in 2008, right? Whatever that is, 15, 17 years ago, like that was all I could think about was probably the quantitative aspects. And as time has gone on, and I think obviously kids being a big part of that, like the qualitative piece and finding that balance between what we talk about all the time, saving for tomorrow, living a rich life today, I'm feeling the weight of that more and more. So the visual that's coming to mind is on a spectrum, right? Because when I get to retirement, when we get to retirement, when our community gets to retirement, I have to imagine that, we're of course less worried about accumulation and the quantitative aspects, and we're more concerned now about, hey, time is finite. Like that window is closing, and how are we making the most of living the rich life in the time that we have in front of us? So, as you're hearing this, I think it's natural to probably view this and maybe even just feel this differently based on where you're at.
Well, I think too is like, you know, we've definitely said this to the students that we've talked to, is like the longer than you can live like a student, the better, especially if you're dealing with debt and student loans and that type of thing. But I think like once you get there's I think an inflection point of where, you're not just staring at hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. There's, you're starting to build a nest egg, and there's more of um and a a kind of an objective view from a place of like abundance versus scarcity. So I think that that naturally happens just because you're starting to see kind of the fruits of your labor. I think the problem that sometimes I see with pharmacists is that they stay there,
Yeah.
right? And they don't make that kind of natural, I'm saying natural, like that kind of natural shift to, all right, like I don't need to be so preoccupied with maxing out and doing this and trying, there's so many people, pharmacists, it's like a checklist. It's like, okay, if I did this, what's the next thing? It's like, all right, let's take a breath. Like, does it still make sense for us to be doing this?
Yeah.
And it's easier, like, it's, we've said this time and time again, it's time in the market versus time in the market. So the quicker that you can kind of amass a sizable chunk of wealth, the just easier it is for the next 20 years, 10 years, 5 years to get to retirement and get, have what you need. But, you know, we work with clients where they'll say like, I don't know if I have, I'm in my late 30s, early 40s. I don't know if I have more than 10 years. Like I'm dealing with some health things, or I just have a history in my family that changes the game quite a
Yeah.
bit. Right.
Yeah.
So everyone's going to be different. It gets back to, it depends. But I do think that, again, I think that's the power of a financial planner, or at least someone that's helping you with this, is to kind of, take those azimuth checks from time to time and, check in the map and say, okay, like, are we still on the path that we want to be on? And if we're not, let's course correct, because our time is finite. At the end of the day, like we don't know how much time we have, and we want to basically put the things that matter to us most first, right? And we don't want to be reckless, but I think it's really, it kind of somewhat flies in the face of, I think, traditional financial planning.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's where the life planning just fits in so well, right? Because here, as we talk about this balance, quantitative and qualitative balance, the life planning is a framework that can really help us zoom out and kind of look at this question of, why do we care about money? What's the purpose? What's the goal? And how do we balance this qualitative aspect of the financial plan with the quantitative aspect? And let's be clear, life planning, and we'll talk about the components of life planning. Life planning is valuable, I think, for anyone, regardless of stage of career, right? So here we're, of course, talking about the transition into retirement, because we know that there's a big shift emotionally that happens when someone makes that transition to retirement. But I've gone through the life planning process, Justin. I have with you, 5 or so years ago. So this is a valuable tool, and we have pieces of this that we do with all of our clients, regardless of stage of career. But here we really want to hone in on the specifics of this transition to retirement and how the life planning framework and process can be so valuable. So, Tim, as you have gone through the certification to become a registered life planner, that program, that training uses a framework called the EVOKE methodology, and that was developed by George Kinder. We'll link to some information in the show notes for those that want to read a little bit more on that. Can you explain at a high level what the EVOKE methodology is, why it matters, and especially for those as we think about this transition into retirement?
And just to back up a little bit more in terms of like life planning and what it is, it's really, life planning is really a client-centered approach to financial planning that goes beyond money and investments. It's really about helping clients discover what makes life meaningful to them and aligning their financial strategies to support that vision. And really, it's at the end of the day, it's basically, it focuses, traditional financial planning focuses on money as the angle. Life planning flips that. The client's life's goals and values come first, and the money is really it's really just a tool to realize them. So the way that we really deliver this, or the structure, the framework that we really deliver this, is called the EVOKE process, or the EVOKE methodology. And EVOKE is just an acronym. The E stands for exploration. So these are really deep conversations that uncover what your values are, what your dreams are, your fears, your life goals. It often starts or involves George Kinder is the father of life planning, like his 3 questions. And we can kind of talk about that here in a second, but they're designed to clarify what matters most if time and money were limited. The V in EVOKE stands for vision, and this is really helping the client articulate a vivid, emotionally compelling vision of their ideal life. So typically in this stage, the life planner is going to do what's called lighting the torch, which is basically having that vision, really breathe life into that and get you excited about, what you're trying to accomplish. In the EVOKE process is obstacles. So often what happens in this, it's human nature to say like, yeah, that sounds great, but what about this? It's the what about section. So obstacles is O, and it's really identifying internal and external barriers, whether it's financial, emotional, behavioral, that could prevent us from achieving that vision. And then really the K and the E, K is knowledge. This is really educating empowering clients on financial strategies and practical steps to support the vision that we just outlined. And then the last E, the execution stage, is putting that plan into action with accountability and ongoing coaching to ensure progress towards, this vision that we've laid out. So I look at the E, V, and the O as really core to life planning. And then the K and the E is kind of knowledge and execution. That's kind of plugging that back more into traditional, financial planning. So that's what the EVOKE methodology looks like.
Yeah, Tim, I'm glad you ended there, because that was exactly the thought I had. Is if you think about traditional planning, right? It's E, it's the end E with a little bit of K sprinkled in, right? Depending on how heavy the education component is. And what I love about the life planning process, and I want to talk for a moment about kind of how we have embedded this in our own planning process, is, as you said, the life plan is at the center of the financial plan and is directing our financial decisions and how we're executing those. We tend to do that backwards, right? We either start saving for retirement, or we start, throwing money at debt, whatever would be the financial goal we're working towards. We just go off and running without kind of taking that step back of saying, where are we going and why are we going there? And so the way that we have embedded this in our financial planning process, which we call the roadmap, specifically in the first year for our new clients, is step number 1, we got to make sure that everything's organized, right? Get organized. And then step number 2 here, relevant to the life planning discussion, is what we call script your plan. And Tim, just talk to us for a moment about why, from the thousands of times that our team has done this in the iterations over time, why we have landed on get organized and script your plan. Here, the connection to the life planning process, so critical before we actually get to developing and delivering the financial plan.
Yeah. So the get organized, um, meeting is really designed around trying to determine what is the snapshot of your current financial picture. So it's very much, it very much resides in the client portal. So before the meeting, the client typically will link check-in savings, credit cards, investment accounts, mortgage, value of the property. And what we're really trying to do in that meeting is kind of go line by line through all the things and understand what their balance sheet looks like and kind of where they're at from a net worth perspective. So like I said, we measure quantitative progress more, especially in the accumulation phase as, are we growing your net worth year over year, not by the 2%, which is what the average, but by much, much more than that. So that is kind of an indication of where we're at. The second meeting, which we call scripture plan, is very centered around kind of around the life planning principles. But it's designed to kind of determine like, where are we going? So in this meeting, we do the 3 questions, which essentially are, in a summarized version. The first question is, if you had all the money you needed, like what would you do with your life? So your financial needs are met. The second question is, so this is kind of where you're dreaming. You're like, oh, I don't have to, I don't have to work. Like, what am I doing? Now, a lot of people, they're like, well, I actually really like work. And a lot of people are like, I'm definitely, I'll do something else or whatever.
Different. Yeah.
But it kind of gets you to really stretch your legs a little bit in terms of like, okay, what would I do with my life? The second question is more time bound. It's like, okay, if you find out that you had 5 to 10 years left to live, but your financial situation is what it is today. Like, how would you live? Like, how would you live differently? What would you do? Right. And then the third question is more like, if you found out that today was your last day, you had 24 hours left, like, what did you miss? What did you not get to be? What did you not get to do? And, this is kind of where the real conversation comes a lot to life. And then that really is like kind of where we're centered in on, like, what are your passions? What's your heart's core, so to speak. And it's a place of vulnerability, right? And not everyone's comfortable with that, so we take those questions along with, a timeline, so to speak. And that really informs us of like, where do we want to go? So without the where are we at and where are we going, the get organized of where are we at and where are we going, the scripture plan, we really can't inform or we really can't advise clients on their financial plan, right? So my default answer to every question that I'm asked, hey, Tim, should I invest or should I pay down debt? Should I do X or Y? Is it depends. And what it depends on is, what does the balance sheet look like, which is what we establish in the Get Organized meeting? And what are your goals, which we establish in the scripture plan meeting, which are going to be unique to you, right? So I often hear like, oh, my brother-in-law did this, or my boss, my mentor thinks I should do this. They have no idea what your balance sheet looks like. They have no idea what you and your spouse's goals are. So like those pieces of advice, they don't really hold water. And I think another thing that kind of grinds my gears is like, we talk with so many pharmacists, especially lately when we were talking about the whole life episodes that we released, that, it's like, hey, I'm a financial I'm a financial advisor. You have a pulse, Tim. Let me sell you this product that I have no idea if it makes sense for you. So it's almost like hammer, see, nail, right? And it's just more nuanced than that, right? So I think it's the way that we do it is really to kind of inform the rest of the financial plan. So once we know where are we at and where we're going, then we can actually give you advice that is in your best interest. That's not tied to a product or anything like that. And I think that's where the magic happens. What I typically do, on the back end with clients, especially if they're going through a transition or whatever, is do more of a deeper dive into the life plan and stuff, where we get into more of the inspirational work, the heart's core grid, the ideal schedule, to kind of, circle back on those things and make sure that they're captured. And really what life planning is, like what we haven't really discussed, is that financial planning, in our opinion, is a lifelong thing, right? You should be working with a financial planner for 20, 30, 40 years, whatever that looks like. But it's hard for us to, sometimes it's hard for us to connect with a plan that's that long. Meaning what the life plan really does well is it chops it up into like bite-sized pieces. So when we when we outline a vision, Tim, we're really trained to do something in 12 to 24 month bursts. Because anything shorter than that, it's almost like you don't have enough time to do it. Anything longer than that, we feel disconnected, right? So even putting out like a 5-year plan, it's hard for us to do that. So it's really like executing a vision in sprints. So 12 to 24 months and being singularly focused. Like the first time I was life planned, after I had the vision, it's like, and that was relayed back to me, I felt like I could run through a wall. And that's really all that I thought about. And the idea is for you to sprint to that and be consumed by that and then cross that finish line. And then it's almost like on to the next one.
Excellent. Yeah.
So that's the idea behind it.
Yeah. And what I love about this too, and I think our planning team does this incredibly well, is this is not a one and done conversation up front. So you talked about the get organized and script your plan. The opportunity here is really to bring that back for all the reasons you just mentioned. And goals will change, right? Over time, phases of life change, of course, but to bring those back and say, hey, we said this was important 12 or 24 months ago. Like, are we moving forward on this, or is there something that's changed or something that's gotten in the way of it? Right. So just like any other type of goal setting, I think this is unique, obviously, as we're talking about the connection here to the financial plan. We've got to establish this, we've got to set it. And I think especially for two people that are working on the plan together, so much value that can come from hearing what the other person has to say if you already haven't, taken a deep dive into that. And then how do we bring that back over time as we naturally, human behavior, are going to get hyper-focused on the numbers, right? And I would argue whether you're just beginning your career or, again, as we're talking about here, transitioning into retirement, the numbers might look different, but the value of these questions and these components remains the same, right? Because of the transitions that will naturally happen through our life. So you mentioned the 3 questions. The other 2 components I want to talk about, which you've alluded to, are the Heart's Core Grid and then the ideal schedule. So when I think about life planning and the EVOKE methodology that you will often do as a registered life planner, I think of the 3 questions, the Heart's Core Grid and the ideal schedule. I'm simplifying, obviously a bit for the sake of a conversation. And I think you articulated well why the 3 questions can be so valuable, forces us to take a step back and really remind ourselves that, hey, time and money, finite resource, are we ultimately prioritizing the things that we want to in the way that we want to, and really taking a look at that. And again, for those transitioning into retirement, so important because we're going through a significant phase of change and transition in life. Tim, as we talk about the Heart's Core Grid, now that we have the framework of the 3 questions, this really helps people distinguish between the things that are closest to their heart, their passions, the things that they feel like they ought to do, and then the things that they would find fun to do or enjoyable to do. So talk a little bit more about the Heart's Core Grid and how this exercise could potentially help retirees cut through some of the noise, or those transitioning into retirement, cut through some of the noise and get clearer on what truly matters to them.
Yeah. So if you can imagine, people that are listening to this, like a table, right? And the table's basically 3 columns by 3 rows. So the first column we call Heart's Core. The second column to the right of that is ought to. The third column to the right of that is fun to. And then the rows are essentially, the first row are have, do, and be. So have are things, do are actions, be are qualities. So the exercise is to fill in each box as best you can of things that make sense for you. So like, what would be things that would be fun to be? What are the actions that you ought to do, like pay your taxes, or ought to have, a roof over your head. But then what we really want to focus on is the Heart's Core, the passion things that you should have, that you should do, or that you should be, right? So it's kind of a different way to come at the 3 questions. And from a retiree perspective, it's really, I think it's really, again, an exercise that it's something that, I'll give you an example. So, my wife, like when we talk about retirement, she's like, I just want to be where the kids are and I want to be close to my grandkids. And I agree with her to an extent, right? Part of me wants that as well, but I also don't want to be, and I see this sometimes with retirees, that they go so far to that side that their retirement is really not their own. They're really like daycare or a second set of hands, which is not a bad thing, but it's almost like what we talk about when we talk about like saving for kids' education versus retirement. Like we want to put our mask on first and then your kid's mask, so to speak. So I definitely want to be part of my adult kids and my grandkids, but not necessarily at the expense of the things that I want to do in retirement. Like I don't want to be tied to where I'm going to be, grandpa daycare. Now, if it's needed, obviously, for short, like that's fine. But that's one of the things, the disagreements that we have, like between, the two of us. So those things, again, like as you're doing this as a couple, it kind of susses out like differences, and then how do we adapt to make sure that both partners' visions and both partners' heart's core grid is represented in their plan, right? So from a retiree perspective, so much of your life is these are the things that I would ought to do, right? I ought to work. I ought to pay taxes. And then a lot of the things that are fun to do kind of get, put on the back burner. And a lot of those things should then move more to the front and more towards that heart's core column of like, what are the things that you're passionate about? So again, if you strip away things like work, what does that look like? You kind of have a blank, so do you want to paint? Do you want to sleep in every day until the sun comes up? Do you want to, travel more? Do you not want to travel more, right? Everyone likes to travel. Not maybe there's a lot of people out there that are homebodies. Like it's okay not to travel. Do you want to travel internationally or more, domestically? We have a lot of great national parks and things like that. Do you want to, visit baseball stadiums or do the Bourbon Trail? I'm kind of thinking of my own life plan, right? So like these are things that I think are really important to kind of throw against the wall and then organize in a way that makes sense for you. And, I started reading a book called 4,000 Weeks, and it's basically about like how time management and work-life balance is just like a ruse. Even if you're great at that, your schedule more stuff comes in, right? So it's an never-ending thing of like checklists and to-dos. And the same could be true for retirement. So if you are intentional, there's that word again, if you're intentional about this and you throw those things and then organize it in a way, then we can kind of really focus on that leftmost column of what's your heart's core of the things that you ought to have, ought to do, and ought to be. And that's where we want to live. And that's the exercise, with the heart's core grid.
And again, just to bring back the quantitative and the qualitative piece, you can start to see why, if we're not prepared quantitatively, it's hard to execute what we want to do qualitatively, right? These go hand in hand. So when we're talking about investing time, investing money in some of the heart's core and the passion types of things, obviously there has to be some component of, hey, how are we going to replace our income if that's a necessary step or a goal that somebody has. The last piece, Tim, I think is the one where we really get more granular. I think of us kind of coming down, the mountain on this, where we're starting with, the vision. We're asking some of the big questions. We're then getting more specific. Another way to look at the three questions, as you mentioned, would be the heart's core grid. And then really where the rubber meets the road would be the ideal schedule. So these are the things that we said are important. Now, what does this actually look like, right? This is where we build out our ideal day, our ideal week, or even our ideal year. And I think for retirees especially, I'd love for you to speak to this, or those transitioning into retirement, can be so powerful, eye-opening, scary. I don't know what the emotion would be depending on how you're looking at this, right? Because so much of this schedule, if you've been working 40 hours a week, and, as we talked about earlier, as we started the show, we think about, kids' activities and other types of things that are happening, community events, et cetera. So much of the day, I feel like right now we're in this phase, we're just living day by day, right? So this idea of there's a blank slate in some regard could be thrilling, or it could be scary as heck, right? So tell us more about this exercise and why it's so important.
So the ideal schedule exercises, it assumes that you have the financial means to live as you like,
Right.
right? So that's kind of where we're looking at this. And so, with that said, if I were doing this now, my ideal schedule would have lots of soccer practice, swim practice, things like that.
Yeah.
That's going to be constant no matter what.
Yeah.
But if you're looking at it from the retirement perspective, it's like, okay, like, as we talked about at the start of the episode, like, I'm not going to be changing diapers then. I'm not going to be driving kids to practice. So like, how am I filling my time? And I think that sometimes like couples can get in trouble here because so much of their relationship has been centered around, raising a family that they fail to maintain that spark or connection with their partner. And they're almost like strangers, so you see that a lot. But so I think like it's, again, so this is kind of like a PSA to make sure that you're dating, through your marriage, and you're carving out time for you and your spouse if that's your situation. But the ideal schedule, like, it's interesting because, if you strip away a lot of, like, if you read as financial means to live as you like, a lot of, for that means people, they don't necessarily have to work, or it's, I get that all the time with this question as we go through this, is like, I like working, but I don't want to have to work. I want to have the option to work, or, kind of, work PRN or consult, or as I need. So then, like, okay, then in the absence of that, like, what are we doing? Right. So you go through, the first is kind of the ideal day. So, you describe hour by hour. So just imagine kind of a table that is out, 6 o'clock or whenever you get up, not 6 o'clock for me, 9 o'clock to midnight. And then there's a space that basically says, this is what I'm doing this hour. So whether that's waking up with the sun, drinking coffee on my back porch, reading the paper, doing a crossword puzzle, having breakfast with my significant other, getting changed to go to the gym. Like this is an hour by hour kind of detail of your ideal day, right? And then you're kind of really want to star or circle the things that you're most excited about, you're most passionate about. Because one of the things, like, I look at my mom, for example, she's one of those retirees where she has like a lot of activities, and she lives in a community, and she's just doing line dancing and this and that, and they play cards, and it's almost like she's that retiree is like, how did I ever have time to like work, right? Which is great, but also like what I would challenge her on is like, are all the things that you're doing the things that you are passionate about, or it's the things that you like feel like you're obligated to, you ought to do, right? So just making sure that, again, we have a finite amount of time. Like, these are the things that I want to, we're passionate about, that we need to put in the day. So you go through that with the ideal day, and then you do the same thing, but you look at it from an ideal week. So instead of it just being, a singular day, it's Monday, basically Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So like, are your weekends a little bit different? Does something happen on Tuesday? So you're basically doing the same thing, but it's for each day of the week. And then the last one is like the ideal year, right? So describe month by month, how would you spend your ideal year, each month of your life, if you had the resources to live exactly as you want it. So like right now, I love this time of year, Tim, because
Amen.
It's my birthday coming up, it's starting to cool down. Baseball players are starting. We're kind of a couple weeks into the football season. Lots of great fall beers. There's lots of great releases on bourbon. Like, I would love to center my ideal year around like early fall with that type of stuff, right? Sports and, urban chair and beer tastings and things like that. It's cooler. So if you're a runner or something like that, you're not dying as much, as you are the summer. But, like, are you a snowbird, right? So I grew up in New Jersey. I feel like a lot of people in New Jersey, they retire to Florida, right? So but they might maintain a residence in the Northeast, right? So, are you spending, the winter months in Florida and then the summer months in the Northeast? Are you traveling? I think one of my great, ideas would be, because I think there's when I talk about with Shay, is like, our kids are probably not going to be in the same spot, more or less, right? So like, do we just travel to them? Do we travel internationally to Brazil, which is where she grew up, So like, it's kind of looking at that month by month and slot in a month for like, okay, for the month of February, this is what I'm doing. Maybe in March, I'm laying low, that type of thing. So again, it really is an exercise in stretching your legs to dream, to be vulnerable, to be excited, and to really understand that, again, when you're transitioning into something like retirement, there is a lot of potentially time to fill, especially if you're stripping away the things which have typically, if you're raising a family, will go away naturally, like running kids to practices and things like that. So, I think it's a great exercise to sit down quietly, do this inspirational work and see what comes out, because I think what often happens is there's clarity, but there's there can be some surprise about like, wow, like I need to work on this, right? Because if I don't, I'm going to be drifting aimlessly. And that's where we start to get into some of the danger of retirement, where, maybe there's not a great social connection with a spouse or a friend group or a community. That can lead to things like alcohol dependence, drug dependence. Like we're seeing those rise in retirement in retiree populations. Physical fitness, those types of things like depression. So it's really, really important, again, for us to be intentional. We talk about intentionality with the financial plan and where your money's going and that type of thing. But the life plan and having intention there, super, super important.
Yeah, and what's coming to mind as you're talking and the emphasis on intentionality, which I love. Going back to the example I gave to start the episode, Dave Zagaric, I think, has done this incredibly well. He had a very successful multi-decade career in academia. I'm sure he had challenging, stressful seasons, but overall, I think he got a lot of joy out of his work. Was able to build a successful quantitative financial plan just through good decisions over a long period of time. And as he transitioned into retirement, he affirmed or realized that, hey, for him, there was a little bit of this ongoing work. So he does some consulting, he does some PRN, teaching, where he still feels like he has a sense of contribution, but it's much more on his schedule. And when he talks about the joys, when I asked him, hey, what brings you joy? Right? It's having a slow morning so that he can enjoy his cup of coffee and not being rushed to get to work. He doesn't have to, right?
Right there with
It's
you.
it's the travel. He loves to travel. It's investing in his physical health and fitness without the constraints of the schedule. And I just thought that was so profound, right? Because when I think about the financial plan, what we're trying to avoid here is this obsession on a future state, which may or may not come in the way which we envision it will come, and that we've amassed a bunch of money to all of a sudden look up and say, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? And where are we going? And I think Dave is such a cool example. He's been successful financially, but listen to the things that I just said really bring him joy, right? A slow morning, prioritizing community, finding time. I mean, he's working in the sense of like consulting and teaching, not because he has to financially, but because he understands that for him, that sense of contribution and providing the values to others, great. If you're going to pay me for it, I'll get paid for it. But like that's not the purpose of why he's doing that. And I think it's so interesting that, it's not some of the more lavish things that we might tend to think about, or, the concepts or stories we're told about retirement of like, hey, this future state, we're going to have $3, $4, $5 million and just do nothing. Like that's what we're trying to avoid, right? When we talk about the life plan, is entering this season with intentionality, yes, quantitatively, but also qualitatively. And really, to bring this all together, our challenge from a financial planning perspective is, how do we bring these two things together? Right? So how do we bring the 3 questions and the hardcore grid and the ideal schedule with your financial plan quantitatively, the buckets of dollars that you have saved, our Social Security withdrawal strategies, right? How we're going to look at the transfer of wealth, if that's a goal, how we're going to look at giving strategies, how we're going to build a retirement paycheck. All of that is really important, but we're trying to pair it here with the qualitative aspects as well.
And I think too, like particularly with retirees, I think it's really important to have your ducks in a row when you are no longer punching the proverbial clock, right? Because I think like one of the things that's very evident with just kind of looking at some retirees and my parents and that type of thing is like, our time is finite, But what's even more finite is our our ability to kind of move around in the world, right? So like my parents are in their 70s, and for them to kind of like travel internationally, like it's harder, right?
Yeah,
So
different.
like
Yeah,
the early stages of retirement, or if there are things that you've put off that are in your heart's core grid, that's a passion, like a trip, whether it's an African safari or a European trip or something like that, like do it. And the sooner you do it, the better. And I forget what book it is, but like the I forget what book it is, but this makes a lot of sense, and I should know it. But basically, like, if you have that trip in your 50s or early 60s, you enjoy that trip a lot more as if you had it in your 80s, because you've had
different.
decades
Yeah,
to kind of review about. Like I always talk about, I did a 4-month backpacking trip after I got out of the army in Europe. And like, I still look back at that and like, man, that was great. I've
yeah.
had decades of like great memories on that. Right.
Reliving
So
the experience. Yeah,
right. So
yeah,
you're reliving that, but it's also like you're able bodied. And I'm not saying like when
yeah.
you're in your 70s and 80s, like you're not able bodied, but it just becomes harder um, to do some of those things that you've put off because you've been working. And I think again, the people that I think that can really a lot of pharmacists, again, type A, intelligent, successful, they're often the go-to person or whatever with whatever they're doing. Like if that goes away and you're not necessarily, people aren't asking like, how do I do this or that, or taking care of patients? Like, how does that affect you?
Yeah.
Right. So build in a life plan that maybe scratches some of those itch. Again, it's going to be all important, because again, I think what happens is, you drift. And I think it can lead to things like depression and things like that you don't want to go down, right? And isolation. So, um, it the quantitative side of things are so important, right? They
Yeah.
are, but it's the qualitative and the life plan and stuff that I would argue are, they should come first, right? And we need to do these in the constructs of the financial plan. And the sooner you do it, just like with amassing a nest egg, the better, because you're going to have those memories, the utility of the experiences that you have. And I always make the joke, whether you're in the accumulation phase or the withdrawal phase, the retiree phase, it's like you're not gonna like be on your deathbed and be like, I should have maxed out my Roth IRA. You're just like, I should have had more experiences with my kids or with my
Yeah.
spouse, or those things are going to be important. And I think what you were alluding to was like, so much of the life plan is not about money at all. It's really just the tool to make those things come to be, right? And a lot of times money is not even it's not a factor in it at all, right? It's like, okay, if we want to do this, it's more about dedicating your resource of time and making sure that is something that you are focused on, and then holding you accountable to that. Sometimes it is like, hey, we want to divert X amount of funds to do this huge trip or whatever, and that's cool. But a lot of the conversations are not about money at all, and it's interesting to see, right? That's one of the
Yep.
surprising things about being a financial planner or being a life planner, is that a lot of the it's relationships.
Yep.
It's that mentality.
Tim, great stuff. And if you're listening and you're in that transition phase, or even to be honest, if you're years away, it's worth asking these deeper life planning questions, because when your financial plan is built around what we've been talking about, right? Your values, your passions, your vision for different stages of your life, that's really where we believe money can become the tool that it's meant to be. And so if you'd like to explore these questions and building not just a retirement plan, but a financial plan that truly aligns with your life plan, your goals, and your values, we'd love to connect and discuss further. At YFP, as you know, we have a team of fee-only certified financial planners that help pharmacists one-on-one. We work with pharmacists virtually nationwide, those that are entering retirement to those that are thinking about this years in advance as well. So you can learn more about our services and what's involved, and book a free discovery call by visiting yourfinancialpharmacist.com. Tim, as always, thanks for sharing your insights. Really enjoyed the conversations, and we'll be back next week.